Systems engineer, Chuck Nolan, Tom Hanks, works with Federal Express. He demonstrates how FedEx operates to several employees in Moscow, Russia. He stresses the importance of timing, emphasizing that the parcel sorting must be finished exactly on time. He takes out a small timer from a package he sent to himself from Memphis, Tennessee, the home of FedEx, to demonstrate this. Chuck stops it at 87 hours, which he claims is a disgraceful delivery time given that FedEx's primary business model is overnight delivery of items. The interpreter, who is angry at the crew, mentions an earlier instance in which Chuck stole a child's bike after his delivery vehicle broke down. Chuck claims that the account has been exaggerated and that he only borrowed the bike. He nevertheless completed his deliveries. With a 3-hour time limit, Chuck sends the team into the parcel sort. The sort is in danger with 15 minutes remaining when one of the vehicles from the Moscow office is booted in Red Square. The sorting of the packages happens in the street. He leaves a message on Kelly's, Helen Hunt, phone stating that he will return there in less than 24 hours and that he needs to visit the dentist due to a toothache. He speaks with his coworker and pal Stan once the sort is through and he is back at the airport, Nick Searcy. One of the crew members inquires about the condition of Stan's wife, who has been battling cancer. As the atmosphere darkens, Chuck shows signs of reflection. Chuck visits Kelly, a PhD candidate, when he travels to Memphis, the location of FedEx. He receives word that he must travel to Malaysia on Christmas Eve while having supper with her family. They exchange Christmas gifts as they travel to the airport, where he will be leaving from. She gives him an old watch that belonged to her grandfather in exchange for him giving her a bundle of culinary supplies. A photograph of her is located within the lid. Chuck is pretty pleased with the watch and assures her he'll keep it set to Memphis time, always to serve as a reminder to return home. He presents her with a tiny ring box just before he boards his plane. It's an engagement ring, even though it's not stated overtly. He had originally intended to pop the question on New Year's Eve, but changed his mind. He promises to return soon. He travels across the Pacific Ocean on the jump seat of a FedEx Cargo MD-11 as the sole other passenger. When the plane encounters some turbulence, Chuck awakens. A powerful storm has contacted the aircraft. The pilots try to fly around it, but they can no longer reach Fiji on the radio. Chuck gets a little fresher by using the restroom. Chuck is almost sucked out of the plane due to depressurization when the door suddenly flies open. He returns to his seat, where a crew member hands him a life raft. The aircraft falls into the ocean after falling straight down. In a split second, water rushes into the fuselage. Chuck manages to reach the surface and boards the raft after witnessing one of the engines blow up. Chuck collapses and ends up on the coast of a tiny tropical island. He instantly notices that Kelly's watch and his pager are both damaged by water. Even though the sound of falling coconuts deceives him into believing someone else could be stalking him, he swiftly realizes that he is alone. Chuck spends a long time trying to open a coconut because he is desperate to obtain food and clean water. Finally, he uses a sharp rock to cut the shell after unsuccessful attempts to smash them against a large rock and a smaller one. He can also spear little crabs, but they aren't a suitable food source as there isn't a fire to cook them. 11 FedEx parcels from the crash have washed ashore, according to his exploration of the island, which led him to a small tunnel in the rock. Additionally, he finds the body of one of the plane's pilots and buries him. Chuck notices ship lights on the shore at night. He tries to signal the spacecraft with a tiny flashlight he found near the pilot's body, but is unsuccessful. He makes an attempt to depart the island the following morning using the rubber raft from the plane. The raft flips over as a result of the strong surf over the coral reef that surrounds the island. His thigh is severely lacerated, and he is thrown onto the reef. He starts to construct a basic camp while recovering from the injury and opens the FedEx packages. He finds a number of things that help him to survive, such as a set of ice skates, a leather and lace clothing, videotapes, and a divorce decree. A volleyball that finally becomes his companion is contained in another package. He doesn't open one of the packages, which is marked with a pair of wings, for some reason. By rubbing a stick on a piece of wood in an attempt to start a fire, he accidentally wounds his hand. He seizes the volleyball and launches it in a fit of rage. He names the ball Wilson after its brand name after leaving a bloody impression of his injured hand on it. He makes the ball his friend. Later, he compares the flight path of his plane to its last known location and tells Wilson that the search region is twice the size of Texas, over 500,000 square miles. He understands there's a slim chance he'll ever be discovered. Chuck eats a little minnow that he catches uncooked while using the dress lace as a fishing net, despite the fact that he is obviously appalled by it. In order to start a fire, he also takes his time rubbing two sticks together. Despite how difficult the process is, Chuck persists, improves his method, and eventually starts a substantial fire. Chuck builds a makeshift shelter in a tiny cave to protect him from the island's sporadic tropical storms. The tooth that bothered him before he left Memphis is still hurting him. It has abscessed and is quite painful and swollen. Finally, out of desperation, he uses a rock as a hammer and the sharp edge of an ice skate blade to extract the teeth. After 4 years, Chuck's hair and beard are long and unruly, and he's shed more than 50 pounds. He makes it day by day. 2 of the walls of a damaged portable toilet made of fiberglass are hurled into the sand after a storm. He immediately is inspired with the notion of making a raft that would utilize the fiberglass walls as a makeshift sail that could be able to get him over the larger breakers encircling the island when he sees it being pushed by the wind. He removes trees and sets up his raft. He weaves rope from the videotape and the bark of nearby trees to connect the poles. He keeps track of how many days are left before he can catch the northeast trade winds, which he thinks will carry him to safety into the shipping lanes. Chuck isn't sure where he is going, but he decides it would be better to perish at sea than live alone on the island for the rest of his days. He imagines Wilson informing him the scheme won't work at one point, so he kicks Wilson out of his cave. Immediately repentant, Chuck rushes outside to see Wilson and offers his apology. For his escape, Chuck prepares food, drink, and other needs. Wilson is also informed that he must create rope again. On the island, Chuck removes the bark off trees and braids it. When he has thoroughly searched the island and has discovered that he has felled every sapling he can, he informs Wilson that the remaining rope must be made from videotape, which won't be as sturdy as the tree bark. Wilson suggests a place for Chuck to obtain extra rope, but Chuck is quite hesitant. Chuck had cut the additional rope when he was considering committing suicide a few years before. Chuck scales the pinnacle of the island and descends with the rope he had attached to a model of himself to test it. Chuck fastens Wilson, his friend, and the FedEx package bearing wing decals to the raft. He is able to leave the island and lagoon with the help of the new sail and a pair of homemade oars. He sails for a long time, faces a few storms, and uses the sail as a shelter. He keeps fishing and gathering rainwater to live. After a particularly violent storm, Chuck is one day startled by water splashing in his face, apparently from the spout of a whale, and notices Wilson floating away. He attempts to save Wilson but is compelled to let him go because he fears losing the raft. He feels hopeless about losing Wilson. When he is awakened by another whale's spout, he has almost given up hope of being saved. When he rolls over, he notices a cargo ship passing nearby. When they spot him, they make a signal. A month later, Chuck is flown back to Memphis where he is the special guest at a big welcoming event hosted by the firm. He speaks to Stan on the return flight, who informs Chuck that they had a funeral for him and filled a casket with tokens of their respect. During Chuck's absence, Stan's wife also passed away, and Chuck thinks back on how Stan had to experience 2 funerals quickly. The president of FedEx, Fred Smith, makes a brief cameo appearance at the event. Chuck stares intently at the enormous crab legs that were served, probably daydreaming about going crab fishing on the island. Kelly had planned to meet Chuck at the party, but she is now feeling really disoriented. Chris North, the orthodontist who treated Chuck's teeth issues, offers his condolences for her absence. He admits to Chuck that Kelly is finding it difficult to deal with his unexpected return. Chuck is urged to give her more time by him. Looking out the window, he observes Kelly sobbing while being consoled by her husband. He also sees Kelly get into a car and drive away. Chuck travels to Kelly's house in a cab later that evening. He is welcomed inside by her, as though she was expecting him. He learns from her how much her life and goals have changed, as well as how she handled his apparent demise, as they converse about little issues. Informing Kelly that the watch she had given him is a family treasure and should stay in her family, Chuck returns it to her. She informs him that the corporation assumed the incident was caused by a dangerous cargo catching fire. She demonstrates to him how far away from the Cook Islands, where the search had been performed, his island was, more than 600 miles. Before being discovered, he had floated in his raft for 500 kilometers. He makes the choice to save her photo. The keys of his Jeep, which she had retained, are given to him. Following their mutual apologies for everything that has occurred, he gently pulls away in the pouring rain. Kelly abruptly chases after him while calling his name. They give a passionate embrace when it is pouring rain as he steps back. She admits to him that despite what others had told her, she had always thought he was still alive. She declares him to be her true love. He claims to also adore her. They converse for a little while longer in his car, but Chuck eventually tells Kelly she needs to go home since he respects her decision to go on with her life. Later, Chuck tells Stan about the encounter with Kelly and how he has come to realize and accept that even though they will always love one another, their life have taken separate paths and they are unable to be together. He admits to feeling complete hopelessness and helplessness on the island, talks about his aborted suicide attempt, and tells how he learned he was destined to survive and came to grips with his solitude. Even though he recently lost her once more, he accepts it and realizes he must enjoy each day as it comes since you never know what the future holds. He travels to Texas in his Jeep while carrying the FedEx parcel embellished with wings. He tries to bring it to a ranch marked Bettina by a wrought iron gate, but nobody is present. With a letter explaining that the package saved his life, he leaves it at the door. He is traveling south when he stops at a four-way stop to look at a map. He is stopped by a kind, attractive woman in an ancient pickup truck who inquires if he is lost. He smiles and admits he wasn't sure where he was headed. She explains to him the destinations of the 4 routes and explains that heading north, the direction Chuck had just come from, leads to a vast expanse of emptiness that extends all the way to Canada. Chuck notices the identical set of wings that were on the gift on the tailgate of her truck as she drives north and pulls away. Chuck moves to the center of the junction and takes a moment to scan each way. His gaze stays in the direction the woman was driving as he suddenly heads north.